Hello and welcome to this episode 16 of TE Present Teacher. And today we are going to be talking about something that has been doing the rounds for a long time in India, and that is inquiry based learning in the classrooms. So, what is inquiry? What do we need to do for an inquiry classroom? How do we get teachers used to inquiry classrooms? How do we get students to buy into inquiry based learning? We talk about all of this, and for this, we have Ritu here. Hi, Ritu.
Hi.
So, right at the outset, I'm just going to, provide a definition of inquiry-based learning, just so that we can put it in context, because inquiry-based learning is a broad concept. It, often overlaps with project-based learning. It often overlaps with constructivism, and so just so that we can make it clear off the bat that this is what we're talking about when we are talking about inquiry. So inquiry learning is basically a teacher or a student themselves asking a question, trying to look for evidence or answers to the question that they have asked. Now, this evidence can be in the form of written documents, where they do the research on the internet, or read by reading books, or it could be actually doing certain experiments and actually collecting data to answer the questions that have been posed to them. And I think it's also important right off at the onset to kind of make a distinction between open-ended inquiry and close-ended inquiry. A lot of teachers in classrooms are probably capable of doing this close-ended inquiry right away. Essentially, there is a matter of just the discipline of just not giving the answers, and we'll come to that in a bit. You ask a question to the students, the answers are actually already known, and the student just has to find a way of getting to the answer, and the teacher is facilitating this process. Um, and open-ended inquiry is probably more for high school students and even probably further in higher education, where students need to probably are actually looking at things at the edge of human understanding or just inside that. Um, However, there have been cases of, I mean, multiple cases of open-ended inquiry even in the middle school and early years. Here, pose a broad question, and the student is expected to break down that broad question into simpler bits, and then kind of go towards answering the broader overall question. So I just wanted all of us to keep these things in mind while we discuss the rest of the stuff. So, Ritu, having said all of this, I'm going to ask you. I'm a teacher who wants to move to an inquiry classroom. I have been doing, more traditional methods of teaching, and I wanted to move to an inquiry classroom. What is it that I need to do?
So, to answer this very broad question of how do you move to an inquiry classroom, I think I'll start with a broad answer. Uh, that is, there needs to be quite a bit of change in the culture of the classroom. And by culture of the classroom, what I mean is how students and teachers interact. One of the first steps that teachers need to take is and maybe probably the smallest step that a teacher needs to take is to be okay with some amount of silence when a question has been asked to students and they're not able to answer it. That time given to students to think through an answer for a few seconds, maybe even for a minute, while there's complete silence in the classroom, is the first step. And we've seen and maybe even experienced years back how difficult it is for any teacher to be comfortable through that silence because we've grown up with teachers immediately giving answers. We as teachers have always been accustomed to giving away answers to students. So the first small step to take is to be okay with that silence while students think through a question and come up with the answer. And once students and teachers have become comfortable with the fact that the responsibility of giving the answer is on the student, and the teacher is not always going to be the one giving them the answer. Next, the teacher then has to be okay with saying that I actually don't know the answer, but we'll find out. Um, that is a big step for teachers to take, because once again, with the culture of classrooms in India, we're usually used to looking at the teacher as someone who knows everything, and that's not possible for any any human being to know everything and to know every answer. So teachers have to become okay with saying I don't know, but we'll find out. And that's how students start building this mindset of being okay with not knowing something immediately, and being okay with going through the process of finding out the right answer, because that is the crux of inquiry based learning.
Right. I think that's a very important point that, what you've made, that the culture has to change. I mean, yes, there are these smaller nuances that you have to be able to wait. The fact that you have to hold yourself and not give out the answer. It's a cultural shift also. I mean, because it's so ingrained in us that, even in our traditional, when we think about teaching traditionally, in India especially, it's always like the guru or whoever is, almost giving their knowledge to the students. So I think that is something that, I mean, that's where a lot of, that's where all of our educational practices come from, and we need to break that if we want to start inquiry classrooms in your school. So I understand that. And so can we now just go a little bit further and think about, what are these specific things that the teacher will need to do? For example, when you said that, okay, the teacher has to ask questions and not give the answers, but a student may not know what to do, how to look for answers, etc. So, what kind of scaffolding can a teacher give in this, um, during this time?
So, one of the first things that may not count as scaffolding, but the teacher definitely needs to do, is be thorough with content knowledge. So, the teacher does need to have pretty deep content knowledge to start of inquiry and support students through inquiry. And again, by that, we don't mean that a teacher needs to have all the answers available to all possible questions, but a significant amount of reading and understanding of the content beyond what the textbook has given is the first step that the teacher can take. Um, and in terms of scaffolding this process for students and maybe even for the teacher, it's a good idea to not start inquiry based learning by giving students a very open ended question, because that is probably the most difficult form of inquiry, which teachers need a lot of experience to do, and students also need to be very, very comfortable with. So the first step here then is for a teacher to come up with a question that is a lot more focused. Um, it's closed, there is an answer that students can find, but they have to go through steps, they have to go through this process of inquiry to find it without meandering too far.
Yeah, I think those two are great points, and having the content knowledge is very important. I feel, and it makes a lot of sense. If I were to think about doing an inquiry classroom for political science, for example, my first thought is going to be that, hey, wait a minute, I need to read up on the Indian Constitution. I don't know enough about it, because if I have to forget about knowing the answers, if I have to ask the right question for to the student, I really need to know the right question. And to know the right question, I need to know about the content. I need to know that I can't just ask them about, okay, what happens in the presidential election, because there is no presidential election. I mean, I'm not going to be that bad, but you get what I'm saying. And going further with the second example, I mean, the second point that you made about, starting with a more focused, closed inquiry. I understand that's a great point. And, instead of starting with something like, um, why are most leaves green in the world? That's a very broad question to start off with. You could start off a science inquiry by asking that, why, how tall can trees be? For example, why are some trees taller than other trees? Um, is there something there? So these are things that will start a question that, okay, what, is there a limit to trees? And then you go look for the tallest trees, and you kind of find out the reasons, and then you move into transpiration and hence photosynthesis, etc. So yeah, I think those I understand that it's, even though you might feel that hey, why are trees tall is kind of open ended, but you know what it's leading to. That tall trees, water has to go right from the roots till the leaves on top. So transpiration is where you're going to.
Yeah, and that's such an interesting question because I don't think I've ever thought about it, uh, about the height of trees. And the way you posed, the way the focused question that you provided immediately made me intrigued and made me curious, and it made me feel like I can answer it, but maybe as a student I don't know where to start. I might start by looking at trees, of course. I think that's the first thing that kids would do. But beyond that, as a student, I may not really know what next. And so, in order to scaffold this process for students and answering the question that you asked, and so the next step that teachers can take in the process of scaffolding this for students is to break this focus question down further into smaller sub questions so that students know where all their inquiries need to
Right,
go.
exactly. And see, even though it's a focused question, it's still a higher level question, which will need to be broken down. And you can start with telling them that, hey, have you seen trees? Let's see what the height of trees are in tropical areas. Let's see what the height of trees are in certain areas. Um, do trees in the desert, are trees in the desert shorter than trees in, areas which have a lot of rain? You start with that, and that's how you're already guiding their inquiry, right? You're already, like, as adults we understand it. Okay, this has got to do with water somehow, because I've said desert and a lot of rain. So we have already kind of primed them to start thinking about water just by asking these questions to them. And that is what we need to do: break down the bigger question into these smaller questions. The bigger question is important to, spark the curiosity and say, hey, yeah, I didn't think of this. And then, break it down to actually manageable bits which they can answer. So, yeah, I get that completely. And I also feel, I mean, along with breaking down the questions, I think another point is that there is going to be a need to build vocabulary in the students. Like, they're not going to. So, firstly, scientific vocabulary. Like, they will have to understand um, the fact that there is groundwater. Now, groundwater is a technical term, but it's fine. At least they should know that there is water uh, in the soil, and that's where it's all the water is coming from. They need to know about gravity also, because there is water that is going against gravity, and that is the reason for the height limits, etc. So there would be a need for the students to know the word gravity and in general what it does, and they kind of have that idea, right? Oh, gravity is what is keeping us on earth, and all those things they know. So that's a decent amount of understanding, but that vocabulary has to be used and built in the students as well, I think. So that is also another, part of the scaffolding that we need to give students while they are going through this inquiry. Even words for the process of what they're doing. That, hey, look up things, research this. Why don't you try this, experiment this? Can you conduct an experiment on this? These are just phrases and things that you have to build with as we go on, because it helps clarify exactly what they're doing, or what they're looking for, or how they're looking for something. And second is, it is going to be useful for them to even communicate what they have done. So I totally understand. And yeah, anything else that would help with the scaffolding of students?
I think uh, and while you were talking about it, it really struck me how important the next bit of scaffolding is that you, as the content expert in this case, you'd know where to find the right information. Because as students, we might just want to look around at the trees around us. But the fact that you mentioned that, oh, you have to think about tropical areas and desert areas immediately made me think that, oh, okay, then I need the internet. But the internet is so vast. Where do I look? What are some credible resources? Or do you already have some books or articles that I can read? So as the content expert, as the expert in the classroom, the teacher really needs to help students with where to find this information or what resources to look at, even if it's not articles and reading material, which tree to go to, what part of the tree to look at are also resources for learning. So the teacher needs to give a lot of support to students in terms of guiding where they can find the right information.
So yeah, I think that's a great point. And in this response, or even in this discussion that we've had on what the teacher can do to make this inquiry easier for students or scaffold this inquiry for students, nowhere have we said that hey, tell them something or give them the answer. We are going to, even if we are saying that point to resources, it's going to be that hey, let them figure out the answer from these resources. So I think that's a very important point, and I'm just kind of underlining bold, uh, making it bold, etc. Um, so moving ahead now, I'm again going to jump back into my teachers avatar and say that hey, you know what? From what you're saying, it is telling me that different students are going to have different learning trajectories. Some student is going to think of okay, if I need to do this, I'm going to look at heights of trees in deserts and in areas where there's a lot of water. Another student is going to say, I want to go out and measure heights of some trees. Only then I'm convinced, okay, this is the limit or whatever they're doing. Um, so how does the teacher handle all of this?
And that's true. Inquiry based learning does lead to a lot of different learning trajectories, no matter what that focused question is or broad question is. Um, and I think here is a good place to talk about a very common misconception that there is around any sort of inquiry based learning or anything that is not explicit direct instruction, is that students decide their own learning goals. That is a misconception. No matter what pedagogy we're using, and specifically now talking about inquiry based learning, the learning outcome for students remains the same. Students may decide to take different trajectories. A student may decide to go out and look at trees. Someone may be more comfortable looking at online resources, or however they choose to research, whatever path they take. Finally, the learning outcome remains what it is. And so here the role of the teacher then becomes uh, that of a facilitator, where the eye is on the goal, the eye is on the learning outcome, and the teacher has to guide students to look for the right answers so they finally reach that learning outcome and learn what they are expected to learn in that classroom.
So yeah, I completely get that. When you're looking at, we've already alluded to the fact that the learning outcomes are going to be around how students will understand the process of transpiration. They'll be able to state what are the different parts that are required for a plant to be transpiring, what are the conditions in which transpiration is going to be high or low. So those are going to remain. That remains whether you are measuring the heights of trees or you're looking at patterns across a geographic region. That will remain the same. How students do it is probably going to be different. Different trajectories are going to be there, um, which we'll try to address in this next part, I think, where I am saying that, okay, you know what, this is going to be extremely, like, the classroom is going to go out of my control with all of these different learning trajectories, students doing different things. As a teacher, how do I manage all of this? Or how do I maintain any control of this?
And that's a question we've heard so many times from teachers as to how do I maintain control of the classroom. And I think this part makes teachers more uncomfortable than anything else, that the definition of control needs to change. Um, we usually think of a controlled, well managed classroom as a classroom where students are sitting quietly at their desks, listening to the teacher or writing quietly, but there's a lot of silence and a lot of independent individual work happening. That is what we imagine as a controlled classroom. But uh, pedagogies like inquiry based learning require control to be defined differently, which is that there's going to be noise. Students are not going to be sitting at their desks in a theater style classroom. There are going to be groups of students. Some students may be working on the floor, some students may be looking at plants outside the classroom. There is going to be noise. But here, Control then means the teacher being aware of what different students are doing, what learning trajectories they are on, and what kind of obstacles they might come up against. Control here means ensuring that all students are going down the right path and getting closer to the learning outcome, and are engaged as they're doing it.
Hi, we have developed an amazing tool to help teachers plan their lessons, TEPS, or Things Education's pedagogical strategies. TEPS helps teachers by reducing the time that they spend on planning lessons. TEPS also helps you if you want to try a different pedagogical approach to teaching. So, if you want to know how to teach a topic in a project-based or inquiry-based or even constructivist learning approach, TEPS is for you. TEPS helps even seasoned teachers with fresh ideas on how to teach specific topics. So, scan the QR code on the screen or visit teps.school and join a community of empowered educators. Great teaching begins with TEPS.
Right. So I think that's a great point. And, just thinking about control in a traditional way of, everybody's regimented and sitting in one place is not supposed to be what control is. It should never be, actually. Forget about inquiry. That's not supposed, let's not just do that at all. I think it's also important then to, a small point that you already made, I'm just going to kind of repeat it, is that you might want to change the arrangement of the desks in your classroom. You don't want a theater style desk arrangement. You might want to keep it a little bit more workstation style arrangement. And I understand that these challenges exist for a lot of teachers where the classrooms are smaller, etc. But you can still make a little bit of space in the center of the class or something where some of these activities can happen. Mm, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit now and talk to you a little bit about the fundamental principles of inquiry. Okay. Now we say that inquiry means you're trying to find out new things, and that students are learning by finding out. Um, Now there's a and this is a sort of a misconception or a misunderstanding with inquiry, that we say that new things are found out by researchers or scientists, if it's a science thing or a social science thing. Let's just call them researchers as a general term. And the researchers have a huge body of foundational knowledge. Content knowledge is very high, on which they are building this research and saying that, hey, I know all of this, humanity knows all of this, and I'm trying to push the boundaries of human knowledge. And that's what they're doing in their inquiry in a way. And when we say that students are expected to do this, but the student is actually trying to actually learn a topic through inquiry. So, it's a little different. So how do we reconcile these two things?
Right. And again, I think this is a misconception that is very prevalent about IBL, is that students have to discover or create new knowledge. That's not possible to do for a student in middle school or high school, because that kind of creation or finding of new knowledge requires a very, very vast foundation of knowledge in that subject, which takes years and years of very specialized study. It goes back to what we've said very often in our conversations, in our newsletters, is that any sort of critical thinking requires a lot of content knowledge, a lot of subject expertise, which students don't have. So, this misconception that students are expected to create new knowledge or find new knowledge is something that we need to do away with. How you phrased it, I think, is really good. That students are trying to learn through the process of inquiry, and that is what the aim should be. That students are learning knowledge that already exists. They are learning the process of inquiry, of how to be okay with not knowing an answer, of identifying where those questions are, what the right resources are to find those answers, to know when they are down the wrong path and get back to the right path. Mm, and in the process, learn knowledge that already exists, to answer this very focused inquiry question. That's what the aim of IVL is in school pedagogy.
Right. And I think if you just tweak it a little bit, and when we say that researchers are trying to push the boundaries of knowledge of humanity, students are basically trying to push the boundaries of their own knowledge, right? When they're doing this through inquiry. So, you just have to bring down the scale a lot as a teacher and then say that, hey, you need to find out new things. And that's what we are trying to facilitate you to do. Which brings me to the a small point where, there are going to be times where, because I don't have enough knowledge about something, I'm probably as a student going to go round and round and not, really progress. So that brings me to an interesting thing that, when facilitation has to happen from a teacher, the teacher needs to recognize that, a student is stuck somewhere or has hit a wall or is spinning their wheels, in the sense of, just the wheel is spinning and they're not making any progress. So that, and on the other hand, also recognize that, hey, the student is almost there. They're figuring it out. Though they are struggling, they are, not getting they're not flowing into the, into the answer or understanding what the answer could be. But their struggles are actually helping them trying to crack the answer there. So I think as a facilitator and a teacher, I would need to recognize this, and deal with it also, right? So yeah, I think a lot of the things that we have discussed about inquiry classrooms, giving students time to think, letting them not just think, but also giving them time and space to do things like experiment things, go back and read. Obviously, that is going to take up much more time than me as a teacher just telling them that, hey, this is what the information is, or using the textbook and reading it out to them. So it brings us to one of the biggest challenges that teachers always talk to us about, that, hey, within the confines of the school structure with timetables and limited time and, multiple different activities happening in the school, how do I do an inquiry classroom when I just don't have time to finish my curriculum? So what would you respond to that?
Yeah, and that's a very valid concern that comes up, and it's a very practical obstacle that teachers face in implementing any new pedagogy, including IBL. And I think the solution to this problem comes down to planning. One, teachers need to start planning, keeping in mind the learning outcome and not the entire topic or the entire chapter. So where is it that I want my students to be? What do I want them to learn? That's the first step. And keeping in mind that there is limited time, the next step of planning then is to figure out which of these learning outcomes will benefit the most from an inquiry-based learning approach, which of these need a more direct instruction approach where I'm giving my students information, and which of these can be done maybe by students at home, because it doesn't really require a teacher explaining some concepts. So sitting down and planning which learning outcomes require what pedagogical approach, which require priority, which require teacher intervention, that is what teachers then need to start doing to ensure that IBL actually works for them.
Right. And I think what you said, just to, go a little bit further on that, when you're looking at learning outcomes, great that you need to prioritize them in, or at least, separate them and bucket them into different categories, that, okay, what can be IBL, and also not think about it as topics. You can actually, or even chapters for that matter, you can club learning outcomes from different chapters, different topics for that inquiry. So, you had 10 classes to cover 3 or 4 topics, because that's how, the curriculum and the schedule or the timetable is designed. But you can use those 10 classes to do an inquiry across these different learning outcomes in these topics. So I think that is also a possible approach. And that brings me to another thing that has often been, asked to us, that, okay, inquiry, everything is fine. We'll do this. We'll figure out time and all of that. But then how do I know that the students have learned? What kind of assessments can I do?
Yes. So again, I think one thing that teachers need to keep in mind is that the learning outcomes of inquiry-based learning are not very different from what we want students to learn through direct instruction or any pedagogical approach. We still want them to build content knowledge. We still want them to have a very strong foundation of whatever topic it is in science or history or civics or whatever subject you teach. So that doesn't change. But in inquiry, we also want students to build skills of finding the correct resources, having the right questions, and along the way, learning the content really well. And so, using the formative assessment approach is very crucial to ensuring that students are on the right path in IBL.
Right. I think that makes sense. Even asking them questions while they are doing their work. So, trying to understand what they're doing, getting them to verbalize some of the things that they're doing. So, for example, if they're, again, let's go back to the example of transpiration, and they're trying to answer a question of, um, why, what is the limit to the trees heights, and you ask them that, okay, how are you doing this? What information have you gotten? And then they'll say that, hey, there's something called xylem in the trees that actually allows water to be pumped up to the leaves right from the roots. So okay, then you know that, okay, okay, so the content knowledge is being built, that okay, there are some vessels in the plants called xylem. Okay, great. Next student, you go and talk to them and they are like, "Okay, yeah." So then you ask them that, okay, but how does the water go from the roots to the leaves? And they don't know the answer to that, or they've still not found out. So then as a teacher, you're clocking in that, okay, this person doesn't, that content knowledge has not been built for the student. So I get what you're saying. Yeah. So the point is to actually do continuous assessments and eventually still have the normal assessments that you would do in a school, because like you said, the learning outcomes are the learning outcomes. They don't really change whether whatever approach you're taking. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Anything that you'd like to add apart from this?
I think the what is important for teachers to keep in mind when it comes to assessment is that it still has to be very planned. The formative assessments have to be planned. So I know what my learning outcomes are. I know what content knowledge I want my students to build. I know what skills I want my students to build. And so having those planned questions, prompts, or small activities that all students have to do for you to be able to see whether they've actually learned these particular concepts, that is very important. So it can't be just a teacher walking around and asking questions without any forethought or any sort of a rubric. So it does require, again, IBL does require a lot of planning from the teacher's end, but the final goal remains that students learn and they learn deeply.
Right. And I think, and this is because there is a lot of debate in the, education research community about how effective inquiry learning is, or, how effective any other pedagogy is as compared to direct instruction. And I think that is why we have been kind of reiterating the fact that doing IBL does not preclude you from learning or knowing content itself. The content, the processes, the skills that need to be built need to be built. Those are inescapable. With IBL, we are adding to that by creating, the scientific rigor, the scientific mindset in the students. So I think that's a great. I think it's a good place to stop. Thank you, Ritu. Thanks a lot, and thanks everyone for watching. And if you like this video, please share it. Share it with all the other teachers in your school. Share it with your community, and yeah, subscribe to us, and we'll keep doing this. And as long as you keep subscribing and you keep watching, we'll keep doing this for free. If you don't, we might still do it because we don't have any other work to do. So yeah.